The courtroom was tense. You could feel it in the air, thick like a storm about to break. The prosecutor straightened his tie, his face a mask of confidence, as he addressed the judge. His words were sharp, deliberate. He wanted the harshest sentence possible. No leniency, no second chances. And the reason? A black woman sat at the defendant's table, accused of a crime that had made headlines. She sat still, hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. But behind those eyes, you could tell. She was tired. Tired of the system, tired of the assumptions, tired of fighting battles that never seemed to end. Her attorney whispered something to her, but she barely nodded. It was out of her hands. And on the other side of the room, the officers who had arrested her sat together, their uniforms crisp, their faces stern. They had testified against her with unwavering certainty. In their eyes, this wasn't just about justice. It was about making an example out of her. The judge took a deep breath, ready to deliver the verdict. The tension in the room reached its peak. And then, just as the words were about to leave, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, all heads turned. A group of men in dark suits walked in, their expressions serious, their movements precise. The insignia on their jackets was unmistakable. The United States Secret Service. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. What was the Secret Service doing here? What did they know that no one else did? And more importantly, how was this going to change everything? And just like that, the case took a turn no one saw coming. The room fell into a stunned silence. The judge, who had just been on the verge of speaking, leaned back slightly in his chair, his brow furrowing. The prosecutor turned, his jaw tightening as he saw the men in suits stride confidently into the courtroom. Even the officers who had been so sure of their case exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't normal. This wasn't part of the plan. At the defense table, the woman's fingers curled around the edge of the table, gripping it like an anchor. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The Secret Service? Why were they here? She had never had any dealings with them. She wasn't anyone important. She wasn't a politician, not a government worker, not a person who should be on their radar. One of the agents, a tall man with close-cropped hair and sharp, assessing eyes, stepped forward. He carried a folder in one hand, and in the other, a small device. He didn't speak right away. He simply looked at the judge, then at the prosecutor, and then at the defendant. "Your Honor," he finally said, his voice firm but calm, "we need to speak with you, privately." The judge's eyes narrowed. He was a man who had spent years on the bench, had seen all kinds of cases, all kinds of surprises. But this was something else. "You're interrupting a sentencing hearing," he said, his voice laced with authority. "Unless you have a very good reason." "We do," the agent interrupted, holding up the folder. "It concerns national security." National security. The words sent a ripple through the room. The prosecutor's mouth parted slightly, as if he was going to protest, but he didn't. Even the officers seemed momentarily thrown. The defendant, though? She sat frozen, her mind racing. National security? That had nothing to do with her, did it? The judge exhaled, measuring the moment. "Everyone except legal counsel and the involved parties will need to clear the courtroom," he finally said. "Now." There was hesitation at first, but then people began moving, filing out slowly, whispering to one another. The officers were reluctant but had no choice but to leave. The prosecutor glanced at the agent before shooting a final, unreadable look at the defendant. Then he turned and walked out. Within minutes, the heavy wooden doors shut, and silence settled over the nearly empty room. The agent set the folder down on the judge's bench and opened it. A few crisp sheets of paper sat inside, along with a photograph. He didn't turn it around. "Start talking," the judge said, his patience thinning. The agent nodded and then, without taking his eyes off the judge, he said something that made the air in the room shift. "The defendant may not be who you think she is," the woman's breath caught. Her attorney stiffened beside her. "What does that mean?" the judge asked, skepticism in his tone. The agent finally turned the photograph around. It was grainy. Black and white, but the image was clear enough. A figure walking down a street caught mid-step. A familiar figure, the woman's face. Only the timestamp on the bottom of the photograph told a different story. The date on the image was from nearly 10 years ago. She stared at it, her heart pounding. That wasn't possible. That can't be. Right, her attorney said, glancing at her before turning back to the agent. My client was in a completely different place, the agent finished. That's what the records say. That's what the official documents show. But this, he tapped the photograph. This suggests otherwise. The woman finally found her voice. That's not me, she said, though even she heard the slight waver in her voice. The agent studied her carefully. Are you sure? She swallowed. Yes. I mean, I don't remember being there. I was somewhere else. The agent exchanged a look with one of his colleagues who stood silently by the door. Then he leaned in slightly. Ms. Taylor, he said, using her last name for the first time. Have you ever heard the name Cassandra Lewis? The name sent a strange, cold feeling down her spine. She had never heard it before. At least, she didn't think she had. But something about it, something about the way it sounded, made her uneasy. No, she said slowly. The agent watched her closely. Then he slid another paper forward. It was a document, an official one. A birth certificate for Cassandra Lewis, born on the exact same day as her, in a different state. She blinked, her mind struggling to catch up. What is this? The agent didn't answer. Instead, he set down another photograph. This one was newer. Color. A woman standing outside a government building. The features were different just slightly, but close enough that it could be. No, this wasn't real. I don't understand, she whispered. The agent's voice was steady, careful. Neither do we. That's why we're here. Her attorney shook his head, visibly frustrated. What does this have to do with the case at hand? He demanded. My client is being sentenced today for a completely unrelated. We believe, the agent interrupted, that your client is connected to something much larger than this case. The attorney narrowed his eyes. Connected how? The agent hesitated for just a fraction of a second before saying, That's what we're trying to find out. The room was unbearably silent. The woman, Ms. Taylor, Cassandra Lewis, whoever she was, felt like the floor beneath her was shifting. This time, she had been fighting to clear her name, to prove she wasn't the person they were making her out to be. But now she wasn't even sure who she was at all, and from the look on the agent's face, neither was he. Outside the courtroom doors, the officers who had wanted her sentenced were waiting, still convinced they knew the full story. But inside this room, everything had just changed, and whatever came next, it wasn't going to be simple. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, stretching out like an invisible weight pressing down on everyone in the room. The judge, who had seen plenty of unexpected turns in his career, was watching the agent carefully, his fingers tapping lightly against the bench. The defense attorney sat rigid beside his client, clearly trying to process what had just been revealed. And the woman at the center of it all, Ms. Taylor, Cassandra Lewis, or whoever she truly was, felt her heartbeat thudding against her ribs like a drum. The agent shifted his stance, his face unreadable. Ms. Taylor, we need to ask you something very important, he said slowly, choosing each word carefully. Have you ever experienced moments in your life that don't quite add up? Memories that feel incomplete? The question hit her, in a way she didn't expect. She opened her mouth to deny it, to say that she knew exactly who she was and where she had been, but something held her back, a flicker of something she couldn't name. Moments over the years where she had felt a strange sense of déjà vu, like she had been somewhere before but had no memory of it. Times when she had woken up from dreams that didn't feel like dreams at all, but rather like snapshots of a life she didn't recognize. Her throat felt tight. Why are you asking me this? The agent exchanged another glance with his colleague, before responding. Because we believe you may have been involved in something, without knowing it. Her attorney let out a sharp breath. This is absurd. If the government believes my client was involved in some kind of crime, you need to present actual evidence. Right now, all you've shown us are vague photographs and a birth certificate for someone else. The agent's expression remained steady. We're not saying she committed a crime. We're saying she might be part of something bigger than she realizes. Ms. Taylor clenched her hands into fists, trying to keep herself from spiraling. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice quieter than she intended. I don't know anything about any of this. The agent studied her for a long moment before flipping through the folder again. Then, he pulled out another paper. This one was different. It looked like a report, something official. He slid it across the table toward her attorney. The attorney picked it up, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the page. Then suddenly his face changed. His jaw tensed, his fingers tightening around the paper. He looked at her. Did you ever work for the government? She frowned. No, of course not. He turned the paper so she could see it. It was an employment record, U.S. government contractor, listed under a name that wasn't hers. But the social security number? It was hers. Her stomach dropped. That's not possible, she whispered. I never worked for the government. I never applied for anything like that. The agent nodded. Exactly. And yet, according to this, you did. Her mind raced. It had to be some kind of mistake, a clerical error, identity theft, anything that made more sense than the alternative. The judge, who had remained silent throughout this, finally leaned forward. Agent, I need you to be very clear about something. Are you saying this woman was unknowingly part of a classified operation? The agent hesitated. We don't have all the answers yet, but we do know that someone somewhere used her identity, and not just once. Ms. Taylor shook her head rapidly. No, that can't be right, that... She paused, memories suddenly bubbling up. Years ago, she had gone to file her taxes, and the system had flagged something strange, records showing income she had never received. At the time, she had been told it was likely a system glitch, nothing serious. But now she wasn't so sure. The agent watched her reaction closely. You've had unexplained events in your life before, haven't you? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The look on her face said it all. The attorney exhaled, rubbing his temples. None of this changes the fact that my client is on trial for a completely separate charge, he said. And unless you have concrete proof that this so-called bigger picture is directly relevant to this case, then... The agent cut him off. We do. Another pause. The tension thickened. The agent turned to the judge. We believe the charges against her were fabricated to keep her in the system long. Enough for someone to make sure she never walked free. Miss Taylor felt like she had been punched in the chest. The judge's face darkened. That's a serious accusation, the agent nodded. And it's not one we make lightly. Miss Taylor barely heard the next few words spoken in the room. Her mind was too full, too clouded. The cops who had testified against her, had they known? Had they been part of this? Or had they been manipulated too? Everything felt surreal, like she was trapped in a movie she hadn't agreed to star in. Her attorney's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. So, let me get this straight, he said, crossing his arms. You're saying that my client was framed, that the case against her is just a cover for something else? We believe so. The attorney let out a dry laugh. And yet, you're only stepping in now? Not before she was arrested? Not before she spent months fighting these charges? The agent exhaled. We didn't know about her involvement until recently. We were tracking something else, someone else. That's when her name surfaced. And when it did, we realized we weren't the only ones watching her. Ms. Taylor felt a chill run down her spine. Someone else was watching her? She looked at the agent, her voice barely above a whisper. Who? The agent hesitated. Then, in a voice just as quiet, he said, We don't know yet. The judge drummed his fingers on the bench, his expression unreadable. This hearing is about to take a very different direction, he muttered. Ms. Taylor barely heard him, because the one question now ringing in her head, louder than all the others, was the one she was too afraid to ask. If someone had been using her identity for years, and then who had she really been all this time?